ready for this?
Yeah,
Oh,
Like it like that.
yeah, yeah.
Hey yo, listen.
What you want?
drop it low to the flow. Oh,
Like it like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, are you ready for this?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone. We got a ton of requests to unpack this idea of African nations breaking free from foreign aid. And honestly, it's a topic we've been wanting to tackle for a while.
Yeah, it's complicated, right? There's a lot to unpack here, both in terms of the potential benefits and, let's be real, some pretty big hurdles to overcome.
Exactly. And that's where this deep dive comes in. We've got some fascinating source material articles, reports, even some personal stories. We're going to dig into the arguments for and against ending aid dependency, exploring the risks, the opportunities, the whole nine yards.
And what's really interesting is that the source material doesn't shy away from the complexities. It acknowledges that aid has been, and in many cases still is, absolutely vital, especially in emergencies.
Right. Like, think about responding to a famine or a natural disaster. Aid is often a lifeline in those situations.
Absolutely. But where things get interesting is when the source material starts to dig into the potential downsides of long-term aid dependency.
Yeah, and one of the arguments that really jumped out at me was this idea that relying too heavily on aid can actually distort a country's priorities.
Right, and I think that's a really crucial point. It's almost like imagine a company that's constantly chasing the latest investor trends instead of focusing on building a sustainable business. Yeah.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, so they might see some short-term gains, but in the long run, they're not really building anything solid. And it's kind of similar with aid sometimes. The source material argues that if a country becomes too dependent on outside funding, it can end up prioritizing projects that please donors, not necessarily the projects that the people actually need.
That makes total sense. But okay, let's play devil's advocate for a second. If we're talking about moving away from aid, doesn't that create some pretty massive funding gaps, especially in areas like healthcare, education, infrastructure? I mean, how do you even begin to fill those gaps?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And this is where this source material gets really interesting, because it's not advocating for just cutting off aid overnight. It's about a strategic, phased approach to transitioning away from dependency. And a big part of that involves some really innovative solutions.
Okay, so spill the tea. What kind of solutions are we talking about?
Well, one of the key areas the source material emphasizes is the need for African nations to diversify their economies.
Okay, so what does that look like in real life?
So traditionally, many African economies have been heavily reliant on exporting raw materials, things like oil, minerals. But what if, instead of just exporting those raw materials, they started processing them, adding value before they ship them out?
Interesting. So instead of just selling, say, raw cocoa beans, they could be making chocolate.
Exactly. Or instead of just exporting crude oil, they could be refining it into gasoline or other petroleum products. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The source material also talks about investing in sectors like manufacturing, renewable energy, even things like tourism and the creative industries.
I actually saw a fascinating article recently about how Rwanda is becoming a regional tech hub. They're attracting international companies, building up local talent. That seems like a great example of this kind of diversification in action.
Absolutely. And that kind of diversification not only creates jobs and boosts economic growth, but it also makes a country less vulnerable to fluctuations in global commodity prices. It's like, remember that analogy about the company chasing investor trends? Diversifying your economy is kind of like diversifying your investment portfolio.
Less risky, more stable in the long run. I like it. But, okay, here's another big question. Where does the money for all of this come from, especially if aid is being reduced?
And that's where the idea of domestic resource mobilization comes in. It's essentially about strengthening a country's own capacity to generate revenue internally.
Okay, so we're talking taxes.
Well, it's more than just taxes. It's about making sure tax systems are fair and efficient so that everyone contributes their fair share. It's about cracking down on tax evasion and illicit financial flows, all that money that's basically leaking out of the system. And the source material even throws out a pretty mind-blowing statistic here. It estimates that something like $88.6 billion is lost each year from Africa through illicit financial flows.
Whoa. Okay, that's a huge GE number. And it definitely makes you think, right? Like, imagine what could be done with that money if it stayed on the continent.
Exactly. I mean, think about the investments that could be made in Education, healthcare, infrastructure, you could fund entire development projects with that kind of money.
So focusing on capturing those lost resources seems like a pretty good place to start. But even with better tax collection, I'm guessing some countries would still need some outside help, especially for really big, expensive things like, say, building a new highway or a major power plant.
You're absolutely right, and that's where the concept of regional integration comes in.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly?
So, think about it this way. What if, instead of every country trying to go it alone, they started working together more closely? Pooling their resources, coordinating their efforts. It's kind of like that old saying, strength in numbers,
Yeah.
right?
That makes sense. And does the source material give any concrete examples of what this regional integration could look like?
It does. It specifically mentions the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AFCFTA, as a game changer. Basically, it's a trade agreement that aims to create a single market for goods and services across the entire African continent. And the idea is that by reducing tariffs and trade barriers, it'll make it easier for African businesses to trade with each other, which should boost economic growth for everyone involved.
Oh, I remember reading about that. It's a
Sure.
pretty ambitious project, but if it works, it could have a huge impact.
Exactly. And beyond trade, the source material also talks about the potential for regional cooperation on things like infrastructure development, energy production, even scientific research. Imagine the possibilities.
Okay, this is all starting to sound pretty optimistic, but I have to bring up something that we often hear in discussions about aid: corruption. And I'm wondering, if we shift away from reliance on aid, doesn't that just shift the target of corruption? Like, instead of corrupt officials siphoning off aid money, they'll just find new ways to enrich themselves.
It's a totally valid concern. And to be fair, the source material doesn't sugarcoat this issue. It acknowledges that good governance is absolutely essential for this transition to succeed.
Okay, so we're talking transparency, accountability, strong institutions, all that good stuff.
Exactly. And the source material even highlights a few specific examples of countries that are making progress on this front. They talk about Botswana's Directorate on Corruption as a potential model for other nations.
So it sounds like, in a way, moving away from aid could actually push African nations to improve their own governance.
That's a really interesting perspective, and the source material definitely hints at that possibility. It argues that when countries are more accountable to their own citizens, it can create a stronger incentive to address corruption.
That's a pretty hopeful thought.
It is, and it's not just about governance either. The source material also emphasizes the importance of investing in human capital. We're talking education, job training, healthcare.
Right, because ultimately it's people who drive economic growth and development.
Exactly. And the source material is especially excited about the potential of digital innovation in Africa.
Yeah.
We're seeing amazing things happening with mobile banking, e-commerce, telemedicine. These technologies have the power to leapfrog over traditional barriers and really accelerate progress.
Yeah, that's something we've talked about before on the deep dive, and it's always fascinating to see how technology is reshaping the landscape. So, okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the potential downsides of aid dependency, the need for economic diversification, domestic resource mobilization, regional integration. It's a lot to digest. But if we had to boil it all down, what would you say is the key takeaway for our listeners?
I think what really struck me about this source material is that it's not just about economics. It's about shifting power dynamics. It's about African nations taking control of their own destinies, setting their own priorities, and charting their own course for the future. And if they can pull it off, I think it has the potential to not only transform Africa, but to really shake up the global development landscape as we know it.
Food for thought. Thanks to everyone out there for joining us for another deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
Are you ready for this?
Yeah,
Oh,
Like it like that.
yeah, yeah.
Hey yo, listen.
drop it low to the flow. Oh, oh,
Like it like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.